Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Conversations with History. In this episode, we're going to cover the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to go back in history and discuss a little bit of Jim Crow and the persistence of Jim Crow, and then we're going to move all the way through the Civil Rights Movement to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the tragic death of Martin Luther King Jr. On this episode, I'm joined by one of my friends and mentors, a colleague, a student, and a teacher of history, Mr. Randall Gilmore. How many years did you teach U.S. history?
I taught American history for 23 years and started advanced placement programs at Sullivan North and Sullivan East High School.
Right, so a lot of experience, and especially with AP, diving into those documents. The point of AP courses is that close reading and writing, and that's something I hope that you can maybe bring out, like we talk about some of these primary sources and how you would break those down. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just the persistence of Jim Crow. We talked about Jim Crow in the Reconstruction era and the Gilded Age. We talked about the reemergence of the KKK in the 1920s and the Red Summer of 1919. But it doesn't go away. Throughout the Great Depression, throughout World War II, even with the push for double victory in World War II and the integration of the military in 1948 through executive order, the South is still very solidly in favor of Jim Crow laws and especially segregation, which was upheld by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson. So what can you tell us about Plessy versus Ferguson, this 1896 Supreme Court decision?
So Mr. Plessy identifies himself as 7/8 Caucasian, 1/8 African-American, and basically it was just kind of a test case. In 1892, he tried to purchase a ticket and board the first class section of a train car and was disallowed from that. And after several appeals, it went to the Supreme Court, who ruled that basically the Civil War amendments, especially the 14th Amendment in regard to protections, civil rights protections, citizenship rights, didn't apply to things like train cars, hotels. It only applied to voting and those type of things. Now, John Marshall Harlan gives a very eloquent dissent, which I would encourage you to read, where he disagrees with that. He thinks it is all-encompassing, the 14th Amendment, and should have covered this particular case. So this doctrine of separate but equal, which, if you look at it, seems ridiculous. We know that the accommodations were not equal, is going to remain up until 1954 and perhaps even beyond. Right. Brown versus Board.
And this is one of kind of the culmination of some bad precedents set by the Supreme Court in Dred Scott, and then later in Cruikshank versus the United States in in Mississippi with the violence around voting, and the Supreme Court fails to uphold the 14th and 15th Amendments as it applies to voting in the South. And then finally with Plessy versus Ferguson, they basically rule that as long as there are accommodations that are quote unquote equal, that separation of the races is constitutional, that the government can, with law, the power of law, separate the races in places like train cars, in schools, in hotels, in train stations. If you go to the train station in Bristol, Virginia, you can see the white sitting area and the original African-American sitting area where they were separated. There were separate ticket booths where African-Americans would buy tickets and where white folks would buy tickets. And that is something that we can still see today. So the big push that we talked about in Reconstruction was keeping African-Americans from voting. That was a big part of Jim Crow and a big part of the dominance of the Night Riders, the red shirts and the KKK. It was to scare African-Americans away from polling places. And by the early 1900s and into the middle of the 1900s, we have actual laws. The KKK doesn't have to ride around and scare African Americans anymore because we have poll taxes and literacy tests in most southern states. So how did those things keep African Americans from voting?
Well, so I think economically they don't have as many opportunities. So having to pay a fee to vote is going to impact them more than it would whites. But then whites who were also poor could get around it through the grandfather clause.
Mm-hmm.
So if their grandfather had voted in the election of 1860 or before, or been eligible to vote, then they didn't have to pay the poll tax. And well-educated African Americans who were required to take a literacy test, they also came up with something, sometimes it's called the understanding clause or the reasonable interpretation clause. So even if they could pass a literacy test, oftentimes the registrar of voters would say, okay, explain that to me. And very seldom ever would an African American's explanation be deemed acceptable, whereas an illiterate white person could just ramble on and the person would say yes. Right. So even though you say, well, these might apply to white people as well, there were ways for the white people to get around it. So clearly it was just targeting African Americans.
Right. And we now have a constitutional amendment against poll taxes. So poll taxes are outlawed. Literacy tests technically not unconstitutional as long as they're applied equally, which, I mean, there are lots of things that even if they were applied equally, we know they're not actually equal, right? But just want to make the point that if a state wanted to institute a literacy test now, it would have to go to the Supreme Court. It wouldn't be just flatly illegal as poll taxes are now. I think I read somewhere that adjusted for inflation, the poll tax for a husband and a wife, if they wanted to go vote, would have been something like $65 or $80 in modern times, which, if you're on a fixed income, if you don't have many economic opportunities, that's a considerable amount of money, even today, and even more back in those days when it was, it was like $7 to $10, which is adjusted for inflation, almost $80 or so dollars now. So 17 states in the South and border states have, and some of the Midwest had schools legally segregated between whites and blacks as of 1950. So 17 states, that's a considerable amount of the United States, have segregated schools. And segregated schools will become the lightning rod for the civil rights movement in many ways. We see, and to me, and when I think about it, I think about the fight for integration of schools, of educational institutions, not necessarily as separate from other issues in the civil rights movement, but it definitely takes on its own character. So with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, we get the Supreme Court ordering states to desegregate schools. And so how does that work? Kind of tell us a little bit about the Supreme Court case, the decision, and whether it's actually upheld.
So Linda Brown, I think my understanding of that, I think she was only like 7 years old, and her father, who was a minister, I believe, had to actually take her by the school in her neighborhood to another school because of segregation. And she asked a fairly innocent question, why can't I go to this school? And from there, the NAACP got involved and Thurgood Marshall. And the question became, isn't a fundamental right of Americans is the right to go to school? And so at that time, the Supreme Court seemed to sympathize with that, but not be willing to act. But Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren at this time, and he took a different point of view and actually convinced, I don't know if convinced is the right word, but through his interactions with the other justices, apparently this became a unanimous decision that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal by their very nature. Now, since the Supreme Court's job is to interpret law and not to enforce it, for many Southern schools, this really didn't change anything. They did not agree with that, so they're just not going to obey it.
And famously in Virginia, it wasn't until the early 70s when Governor Linwood Holton was elected, the first Republican governor since 1869, I believe. So a century before and which really shows you how strong the Southern Democrat hold on the South was. He famously will send his daughter to an integrated school in Richmond, Virginia. And his daughter, of course, grows up and she's the wife of current Virginia Senator Tim Kaine. But that act by Linwood Holton to send his own daughter to an integrated school in a time when many white people were just they could not agree with that in Virginia. And this is in the 70s. This is not in the 50s. This is not in the 60s. This is in the 70s. And of course, the idea of massive resistance, what Harry F. Byrd, a famous Virginia lawmaker, very well thought of, honestly, for a very long time. Of course, he was in many ways viciously racist, but he had a very strong leadership role in Virginia politics during the Civil Rights Movement. He comes up with this idea of massive resistance. So what does that mean?
So basically, since the Supreme Court can't force us, we'll just won't do it. Mm-hmm. Our constituents don't want us to do it because they would take polls, and most people in a lot of predominantly white districts didn't. They feared integration for a variety of reasons. Most of them seem silly now today, but so he and many other Southern legislators just said, mm-hmm. We'll unite, and the Supreme Court has no power over us.
Right, and this movement of massive resistance among white lawmakers in these southern states holds off integration for almost 2 decades. The first place that we really see there's a story of Ruby Bridges in New Orleans, which is another story all in itself. But I think that where the nation really saw the impact of Brown versus Board of Education was in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the governor, Orville Faubus, at the time, refused to allow these 9 African-American students to attend Little Rock Central High School. And he actually calls out the Arkansas National Guard to keep them out, right? So that, like you said, it seems silly to us that the governor of a state is going to call out the military of the state with guns to keep 16-year-old African-American girls from attending geometry class, right? And so how does this play out, and how does President Eisenhower step in?
So I think now we are going to see the power of television, because for most people, this is not an issue that's impacting me directly. So therefore, whatever they're doing in Arkansas is Arkansas's business. But when you see, particularly on the first day of school, the other African Americans got together, the other 8, and we're going to carpool, we're going to go together. But Elizabeth Eckford didn't have a phone, and she didn't know, so she arrives alone. And this is on, it's famously on Forrest Gump, but Americans saw that this girl was being surrounded by an angry crowd that were screaming at her. In fact, I don't know if you can pick it up on the video, but one white woman actually, as she's screaming at her, spits on her. And here she is, just a little high school girl. So for many Americans, I think seeing the images of that on the nightly news was horrifying, even if they didn't consider themselves, supporters of integration. Most right-minded people could see that this is clearly wrong. There's some interesting things that happen with these 9. Finally, Eisenhower does send in the 101st Airborne Division, and they actually escort the kids to class, and they're there all the time. But there's still a lot of racial comments. And in Eyes on the Prize, the story is told of Minnie Jean Brown, who was a 5'10" African-American girl. And I think Ernest Green tells the story. He said, so we're in the cafeteria, and we had chili that day. And he said, this white guy comes up to Minnie Jean, and he said, it reminded me of a Chihuahua. He's just barking at her. He's calling her all kinds of racial comments. And I look at her and I say, Minnie Jean, don't do it. Don't do it. and she dumps her chili right on the dude's head, to quote Ernest Green. So, she got expelled. So the Little Rock 9 then becomes the Little Rock 8. And only one of those folks was a senior, and that was Ernest Green. And so he does, out of, I think there were 501 graduates, he is the only African-American graduate. And because Eisenhower had acted so proactively, what Faubus does the next year, he closes all public high schools in the city of Little Rock. So, they obviously some of them took correspondence courses, some of them went to county schools, but his response to that was, okay, we won't offer education to anyone.
Right. And so the one girl who was expelled, she ends up moving to New York, right? And she finished her education in New York State. But yeah, Orville Faubus shows the lengths to which these people were willing to go to keep African Americans from just sitting in the same classrooms as white kids. And that, to us, it sounds ridiculous, because we, for the most part, have grown up in an era, or at least my generation growing up. I mean, I was born in the 90s. I grew up in a time when it would have been absolutely ridiculous for someone to say, well, we shouldn't go in there because there are black people in there, or I wish black people weren't allowed in the movie theater, or something like that. There just wasn't that idea of being normalized during my lifetime. That was very normal in most of America, not just in the South, but Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, all of these places. We talked about the Red Summer of 1919. One of the most violent racial attacks during that Red Summer was in Chicago, right? So it wasn't just a North-South issue. Right. It was a national issue, but it just so happened that the laws that were actually on the books, where it was de jure segregation instead of de facto segregation, the idea that we're actually going to pass a law to keep blacks and whites separate, that was happening in the South. So in 1955, we've had these issues with education, and the president, the executive branch, seems amenable to helping African Americans attend public high schools. And of course, we have other issues with, like, the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, where they have their first black man who applies and is granted access to the University of Mississippi. And then George Wallace famously stands outside the admissions office of the University of Alabama and tries to keep African Americans out of the University of Alabama, and he's partially successful. But none of that really involved a lot of violence. It was mainly a political fight. With the murder of Emmett Till in 1955, this changes the complexion of the civil rights movement. It's no longer going to be just in court. It's no longer going to be just somebody trying to keep a high school girl from going to geometry class, right? How does this event change everything?
So for me, this is one of those things. I was born in 1962, so it's hard for me to believe that something like this happened just 7 years before I was born. But Emmett Till was from Chicago, and his great uncle, Mose Wright, went up there for a visit and was bringing back another relative back to Mississippi for the summer. And Emmett Till begged his mother, let me go too. Till never knew his father, and his mother said that he was such a great son that he cooked and he did the laundry. And so she wanted him to experience a different culture and spend some time with his great uncle. So he goes, and there's all kinds of accounts about this. But according to some of his friends, he said he was bragging about dating white girls. He's 14 years old, but in Chicago. And they said, you can't talk like that here. Mm-hmm. And so he goes into a store to buy a pack of gum or something. And there's some conflicting accounts, but he didn't do anything real overt. Either he touched the 27-year-old store owner's hand, a white lady, as she was giving him his change or his gum, or he whistled at her, or he said, bye, baby. So I've read all three of those things were reported, but certainly nothing like that should have led to what happened. So that night at 2:30 in the morning, there's a knock at the door of Mose Wright's house, and he comes to the door, and Roy Bryant, who was the husband of the lady, and his brother-in-law, whose last name was Milam, they said, "We want to talk to the boy who did all that talking." And Mose Wright's an older black man who's always deferred to white people because of Jim Crow and just the situation he lives in. And he goes and brings out, wakes up Emmett and brings him to the men, not knowing that they're going to grab him and take him away. And 3 days later, they find Emmett Till's body in the Tallahatchie River, tied to a cotton gin fan. He'd been badly beaten, he'd been shot, and by this time his body was decomposed, but he had a ring on with the initials E.T. For Emmett Till. And so the men were charged with murder, and of course, no blacks were allowed on the jury. The black press was even segregated, and the entire trial, the deliberations lasted 57 minutes. One juror later said it would have been less time, but we were hot and we took a Coke break. So clearly they're not weighing the evidence that these men were identified by Mose Wright as the men who took Emmett Till away. Here's his body. Here's his initials, the ring that was found on him. And they were declared not guilty. Mose Wright's Emmett Till's mother actually had an open casket, and pictures were published in Jet magazine. And the first time I saw the pictures, I was teaching American history, and I nearly passed out. I mean, it was just horrible. 4 months later, Bryant and Milam both sold their story to Look magazine for $4,000, where they admitted that they had killed him, but because of double jeopardy considerations, they couldn't be retried.
Right. And if you read their testimonies, like to Look magazine, and what they had to say, you can't get through much of it.
No.
It is some of the worst. I mean, it is literally unimaginable to us. It is something that you read, like, just to get through a paragraph of it, you find yourself constantly just shaking your head and wondering, how someone could think this way. And partially, it's true that it is unimaginable to us. We have to understand that at the time, the ideas, propounded by those two men to Look magazine, using the N-word, saying that black people were less human than white people, that was a fairly commonly accepted idea in the South. And to overcome that mindset took so long, and it took so much struggle and so much energy by the black community. And that's something I do want to point out, is that many historians have pointed out over the years that abolition was affected by African Americans. The abolition movement was always led mainly by African Americans. Frederick Douglass, during the Civil War, African Americans, almost 200,000 African Americans fight in the Civil War against the South to free their relatives and in the South. We see this again in the Civil Rights Movement. Lyndon Johnson will sign the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, but it wasn't Lyndon Johnson who really affected that change. It was an African-American movement all the way through. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. So this new wave of vigor kind of takes over the black community in the South, and they decide that it's time to start fighting, quote unquote, Jim Crow. And they're going to fight it, oddly enough, by not fighting. They're going to fight it in ways that allow them to avoid violence and cause, problems and resist in other ways. Weirdly enough, they resist in many of the same ways that slaves resisted in the antebellum South, getting in the way, breaking equipment, things like this that slaves did to resist, but covertly. That is going to become the way that African Americans in the South will resist Jim Crow, like the Montgomery bus boycott. So in 1955, we get this new phase of civil rights.
So Rosa Parks, my understanding of this, she had been trained at a college in Knoxville about the techniques of passive resistance, nonviolent resistance, which included, and I've seen, if you ever get a chance to see the old documentary Eyes on the Prize, it chronicles this, but they would basically get in your face and cuss to train you to take this. Lots of times they'd spit as they were doing this, and you were just trained to just totally block it out. So she, on December 1st, just decided to sit toward the front. The rule, I believe, on the Montgomery buses were the first 9 rows were reserved for whites, and blacks could sit row 10 and beyond. And blacks normally comprised most of the customers on the bus. So certainly whites didn't need those first 9 rows, but that kept them from being in any kind of contact at all. She sits on the front row, and the bus driver asks her to move, and she doesn't. So he calls the police, and she's arrested. And many blacks are angry, but Martin King is like, no, we're gonna hit them in the pocketbook. We're gonna and organizes this boycott. So they begin to carpool, they begin to walk, ride bicycles, and actually after a year of doing this, over a year, they financially break the bus company, and then the courts finally rule also that this was unconstitutional.
Right. And so the outcome of this is not only that the Black community now understands that nonviolence is going to be the way that they're going to be able to slowly chip away at Jim Crow, but we see another resurgence of the KKK, and not necessarily just the KKK, but just the ability of the white community in the South to affect violence against the Black community to try to scare them away from fighting for their rights. And 4 African-American churches and the houses of many African-American leaders in Montgomery were bombed in 1957. So,
yeah, and this continues in Mississippi with 2 white, 1 black freedom riders from up north are killed and buried in an earthen dam, and nobody saw anything there. The movement, I try to wrap myself around this. It's kind of like if you go back to the turn of the century, you've got Booker T. Washington saying we need economic equality, and the rest will take place, will occur later. And you've got W.B. Du Bois saying, no, we are entitled for all the rights. And this argument is going to continue as violence is met with the nonviolent movement. They're still facing violence. So King does get some detractors now, predominantly Malcolm Little, Malcolm X, and others who say, no, we need violence. We need to meet violence with violence. But King, I think King's approach is it's going to take longer than it ought to, but I think it's the only one, especially at this time, that could have worked.
Right. And so now we're kind of going to leave the timeline here for a second and just kind of look at some of these associations and organizations that were fighting for and working towards African-American equality. The first one's the NAACP. We're just quickly going to go through these. We could spend hours on this one point. The NAACP, started in 1909 with W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. Famously, those are the 2 most famous ones. Ida B. Wells was a reporter from Memphis who reported, she was a muckraking reporter during the Progressive era who reported on lynching. And she famously called lynching America's national crime. That, all these Black, usually young men, were being lynched, killed extra legally in the South, especially in states like Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. And she brought attention not only to lynching of Blacks, but also in the North, the lynching of immigrants, especially Italians, was very common as well. So they start the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it begins in the early 1900s to fight for Black equality. Then we have the Nation of Islam, which you mentioned Malcolm X. How is the Nation of Islam different in their views? When I think of the Nation of Islam, I think of not necessarily religiously, but kind of their views on segregation. I think of Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement that we saw in the 1920s. How is the Nation of Islam different from what we'll see later with like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference?
Well, there different proponents have different ideas, but for Malcolm X, he famously made the statement that all whites were blue-eyed devils, and so he believes in not integration but total segregation of the races and meeting violence with violence. Now, interestingly, and he gets a lot of controversy too, because when Kennedy was assassinated, he said the chickens have come home to roost. So basically saying he got what he deserved, which, not too many Americans appreciated that sentiment. But he takes a trip to Mecca, and there he sees lots of different nationalities worshiping, and he kind of has a change of heart in 1965. But before he can articulate very many of those changed ideas, he too is assassinated
by members of the Nation of Islam who
Yes.
felt like he was becoming too liberal in
That's
his
right.
views.
That's right. That's
That
right.
he was moving more towards the ideas of Martin Luther King Jr. And away from the kind of segregationist, what W.B. Du Bois kind of called the nation within a nation. That's what he told the people of Atlanta in his speech. I think it was in the 1890s. He said, we need to create a nation within a nation. And that's kind of what the Nation of Islam was all about. And then Malcolm X moves away from that and he's murdered by his own followers.
Right.
Then we have kind of CORE. And CORE is founded in 1942, and it's a lot like SNCC or SNCC. It's mainly northern. These are not really southern organizations. CORE and SNCC are largely northern organizations, and CORE is most famous for sending the Freedom Riders to the South. So what did it mean to be a Freedom Rider in 1961?
So typically they rode buses and they would travel to places in the South like Birmingham, Montgomery, other places, and try to encourage blacks to exercise the right to vote and try to protect those rights. But their buses were often bombed, and as I mentioned, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were three who came from the north to assist in this process in Mississippi, and they mysteriously disappeared. And there was a big search conducted, and they couldn't find any traces. And finally, the FBI got involved, and their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam. But again, the juries are not going to convict one of their own during this time. So I think the Freedom Riders exercised a great deal of courage, knowing that we're going down here to try to protect a constitutional right, knowing that we could die for these efforts.
Right. And so 1961 is the year of the Freedom Riders. And then we'll skip down to SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They are known mainly for the sit-in movement and the Freedom Summer in Mississippi. So we don't have a specific presentation slide for the sit-in movement, but kind of talk a little bit about the sit-in movement, how it begins in Greensboro, how it affects, much like the bus boycott, it's a financial effect on mainly Woolworths, is the store, which at the time was a nationwide chain, correct?
Yeah. So Woolworths drugstores, and there's actually the remnants of one in downtown Bristol still, that the owners, when they remodeled it, it kind of looks much like it did back when I was a kid in the 60s. But the one in Greensboro, North Carolina, for African Americans, they kind of rotated. They were not allowed to sit at the lunch counter. They would serve them at a table in the back, but not at the actual lunch counter. And so they started this sit down that was very well organized, very nonviolent. We're just going to sit here until you take our order. And, after 8 hours or so, then another one would take the place. And this too got national attention. And finally, the chairman of Woolworths said, this is wrong. We're not going to do that. I think they're based in Chicago, and and apparently they claimed they didn't know that this was the
Mhm.
practice, so they changed it. That original lunch counter, though, those 4 seats are in the American History Museum
Mhm.
in Washington, so you can go there today. They still have, the prices of a burger, a hot dog at that time, a Coke, and they usually, I saw them do a presentation there once, and it was led by an African American man. It was very well done, but it's just hard to believe that. Again, we talked about it earlier. It just seems silly to say, I will serve you over there,
Mhm.
but I won't serve you here. When I first started teaching, my assistant principal told me one time, I think she came in to observe me, and I must have been talking about this. But she said, I remember when I was a little girl one time, she said, we were Christmas shopping at a J.C. Penney's, and I went to get a drink of water, and because it was hot, I had a coat on, and she said, about the time the water was going to hit my lips, my mother jerked me out of the line because I was drinking out of the colored water fountain. So,
Right.
it's just hard to believe that water is coming out of that fountain, but you can't drink out of it. You have to drink out of this one. You
Right.
can't sit here. You have to sit there.
I talked to a guy once who grew up in segregated Georgia. He went to high school in Georgia, and he went to a school that was being desegregated, was being integrated, and their football team was integrating. And he said that his father could not believe that they were letting the black players drink from the same water bottles that the white players were drinking from. And that a lot of the parents came and were angry that they didn't have separate water bottles for the white and black players. Like, this idea of separation of the races was so, and he said there were certain players who also had problems with it, but he said in general the players didn't really care, that they felt like they were, going to be a pretty good football team, and they didn't really care where they got their water from. But he said it was a very big deal that friendships were strained when certain parents said, I don't care if my kid drinks after an African American, and other parents were like, well, then don't talk to me because I don't believe that way. And that was happening all throughout the South. And so, very real, silly, but very real to these
very
people.
Real.
Finally, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is going to probably be the most important one. The president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is Martin Luther King Jr. Now, it's important to note he was voted the president by the other members, right? They voted him in as president, and he will maintain that role and become probably the greatest figure of the civil rights movement. So he really comes into his stride. He's part of the Montgomery bus boycott. He is a very influential leader among the evangelical African-American community in the South. But in 1963, he starts the Birmingham campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. And this is where we get the infamous pictures and videos of fire hoses and dogs and state troopers looking like, brown shirts, attacking unarmed children in the street. And, the emergence of one of probably the most hated men in the history of America, Eugene Bull Connor. So what happens during the Birmingham campaign? How does this kind of change and even ratchet up the tension on the civil rights movement even more?
Yeah, so again, I think the power of television can't be overstated. Today we have so many social media outlets and 24/7 news coverage, but in the early days of television, you had NBC and CBS only. There were only 2 networks to begin with. And everyone just about it who had a television watched the national news. And those who didn't own a television went to a restaurant or a friend's house or a bar or somewhere so they could see it. And when the images of those fire hoses, the water pressure knocking people off their feet, and dogs being turned loose and electric cattle prods being used on people who are peacefully protesting and doing nothing, that changed a lot of people's minds. And in fact, I guess it was Bobby Kennedy who talked about how that impacted his brother, John Kennedy, when he actually saw it for the first time, and that's when the federal government begins to get a little bit more involved in these things.
Right.
And of course, I hope a primary document that everyone will read is that letter from a Birmingham jail that Martin Luther King wrote, because it is it's just so powerful.
And
It's
you
beautiful.
will read that during this module in its entirety, and you'll do a writing assignment on it. It is something else. I mean, he lays out the idea of nonviolent resistance in no uncertain terms. This is what nonviolent resistance is. This is why it's the best course of action. And then he talks about what it means for a law to be unjust, and when a law is unjust, what you can do about it. And I think that, and I would encourage you, if you read it, I would encourage you to read it. I get goosebumps when I read it or talk about it. I would encourage you, when you read it, to focus on his insistence that this is a Christian movement. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that wasn't a name they pulled out of a hat. Most of, if not all of, the leaders of this civil rights movement were Black ministers, because the Black congregation, the African American church community, since the times of slavery, had been the place where African Americans met to talk about freedom, to aspire to freedom and equality. And, we go all the way back to Nat Turner. Nat Turner and his rebellion, he was an African American preacher, right? Most of the uprisings in the African American community during slavery were led by pastors. And now, of course, some of those were violent. This is not violent, but it's still being led by those religious leaders. I think that's important to point out.
One of my professors at King, Tom Peake, wrote the first comprehensive history of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference called Keeping the Dream Alive. And he interviewed Martin Luther King's son and Jesse Jackson and some of the other leaders of the movement. And when I very first started teaching, I reached out to Dr. Peake for some advice, and he's offered to give me the phone numbers of these people, because this is before the internet. But I think it's just very difficult for me to wrap my mind around the fact that how could you violently attack someone who is peacefully protesting? I understand protecting police. If someone attacks them, then they have every right to defend themselves and all that. But these are children and women, and they're unarmed.
And allowing children to march and protest was one thing that Martin Luther King Jr. did draw a lot of criticism for. And he said, well, they're just walking down the street. Like, I'm going to be criticized because a cop bludgeoned a child who was just walking down the street. That was his reaction to it, was caustic, because he was like, how are you going to blame me for an Alabama state trooper running over a child on a horse because he was walking down the street, right? So that kind of shows you how violent it was. After the whole Birmingham campaign, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, they decided to have a March on Washington. And it's technically called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? And one of the big parts of this is that it's not just political, it's economic. So the labor unions, northern labor unions, like the AFL and the American Auto Workers Association, partnered with the SCLC to put on this March on Washington, and it delivers to us one of the greatest speeches in the history of our country, right? I think the I Have a Dream speech, to me, the speech that defines America is the Gettysburg Address. If there's a second place, it's the I Have a Dream speech.
Yeah, I totally agree. And note that the Gettysburg Address and the I Have a Dream speech are 100 years apart. So we're still, the goals that Lincoln expresses in some ways, both in the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, are still not realized 100 years later. But this speech was almost not given. It's funny, I just learned this fairly recently. So he has prepared remarks, and he's at the Lincoln Memorial, obviously a great visual effect. 250,000 people, as you note, are there. But he's giving a different speech, and Mahalia Jackson, who was one of the leading gospel singers of the time, and had performed a couple of numbers prior to the speech. If you enhance audio, you can actually see her and hear her say, "Tell them about the dream, Martin.
Mm-hmm.
Tell them about the dream."
Mm-hmm.
And so he had given the "I Have a Dream" speech at a couple of other smaller gatherings, but nothing to this extent. And he pushes his notes aside, and without looking at anything, because this was what he meant, this is what he really believed, he gives that very, very, very powerful speech.
Right, and you will listen to this speech during this module, and it's hard not to, there are many speeches that are given. I think of Winston Churchill's, "We shall never surrender."
Mm-hmm.
That one gets me every time. I think of when you listen to John F. Kennedy in Berlin, and he's speaking in front of 500,000 people, and he says that the West is going to stand with Berlin, and 500,000 people cheer, and people are in the crowd crying. That gets me. This speech as well is one of those that I can't really. It's hard for me to listen to it without tearing up, because and if you watch the video, you see white people in the crowd, African Americans in the crowd, and you see that they believe they're on the precipice of equality. They really do. They think that this day is going to mark a beginning, and in many ways it does, of a more robust government action to ensure the rights of African Americans. And that is a long time coming. It takes a few more years to get those acts passed. And of course, those acts in no way get rid of racism completely, but this is something that is a watershed moment in American history.
Yeah,
right?
no doubt. And while it does lead, as you mentioned, to legislation and concrete things, he also personalizes it. I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will live in a country where they are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And, anyone with a child always wants things that are better than they had them. And I just think, for me, that's the thing that resonates the most with me, is him, wanting a country that's better and gives more opportunities for his kids than what was given for him.
So in 1964 and 65, we get 2 of the most important civil rights legislative acts in the history of the country. Now, we can't forget that in the 1870s, Ulysses S. Grant signed 2 civil rights acts, which were meant to curb the activities of white supremacy groups in the South, like the KKK and the Red Shirts, to protect African Americans at polling places and to ensure the voting rights of African Americans in the South. Those civil rights acts are largely forgotten by this point. They are still, I suppose they still have legal power, but they're derelict. They're not being used by the federal government. And so Lyndon Johnson, after the death of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, in many ways, the rest of the 1960s are a fulfillment of the things that John F. Kennedy put forward in his presidency, the idea of civil rights, going to the moon, the great society that he says, why should we live in a place where we can have anything we want and there's still poverty, So all these things that were part of his platform are tried to be carried out by Lyndon Johnson, and part of that is civil rights. So what do these acts do for the African American community?
So Johnson is such an interesting person. I think, lots of times we kind of make fun of him because he famously holds a couple of pups up by their ears one time, and he's profane, he's vulgar. He had surgery one time. A reporter asked him at a press conference how his surgery went. He opens up his shirt to show the scars. So he's just he's an interesting fellow, but he's a Southern Democrat. He's from Texas, and he does what hardly anyone would have done in his position, I think, and that is he decides to advance these causes. And he even said at the time to aides, what I'm about to do will shut down the Democratic Party in the South for a generation, but it has to be done. So I think in some ways, he's very courageous to go against the grain of what many Southerners believe by signing the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Voting Rights Act of 65 and then Civil Rights Act of 68. He starts this Kerner Commission to investigate the Watts race riots. He puts Thurgood Marshall as the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Robert Weaver becomes the first African-American cabinet officer, Secretary of Labor or Housing and Urban Development. So Johnson, who, is not Kennedy, but he does some things, as you said, to fulfill Kennedy's wishes and maybe even more so.
Right, and we'll get to that with the Great Society later, because Kennedy's inaugural address, famously, he talks about, how can we have poverty in a sea of prosperity, So Bloody Sunday, this is something we're kind of drawing to the close here of this most vigorous portion of the civil rights movement. And this is kind of a rehashing of what happened in Birmingham. This is a march that's planned to go from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, the state capital. And when the protesters get to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they're met by the Alabama State Police. And on March 7th, this protest is broken up violently by the Alabama State Police. Once again, it happens. There's film of it. It's on television. There are pictures in every newspaper. You will see pictures in this module from Bloody Sunday. And I will warn you, as I do on the resources page, it is violent. And there's some, profane language, but these are pictures of history. Those things that those people said in those newspaper articles, that they use the N-word, that while it is grotesque and we don't use language like that anymore, I think we have to face up to those things. The reality of the situation in 1965 was violence and racial hatred. And we can't just say, well, Bloody Sunday happened, but we're not going to look at the pictures and we're not going to look at what anybody said because that might be disturbing. No, it is disturbing. That's why we have to look at it.
Yeah. And I think it doesn't matter if you're defined by a big R or a big D, if you're a Republican or Democrat. I don't think these things matter. I think what matters is the big H. You're a human being. Mm-hmm. And these are things that, politics aside, cannot happen in any country. I mean, we would be appalled and perhaps send troops to a third world country if things like this were going on today, but they were going on in this country. And I think it's important to see that. And, if you feel like you can't do anything on a national level to effect change, you can certainly do things on a personal level in your interactions with disenfranchised, marginalized people and the things that you say and think and write about. So I think this is very important to take a look at.
Right. And in the end, it is a victory for the civil rights movement. Yeah. Because on March 25th, the protesters come back to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They have gotten a special privilege from a circuit court judge to allow them to march. And they go through the legal channels to get this permission. And when they meet the Alabama state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge again, the state troopers know that if they stop this protest, it's their job. And they move out of the way. And of course, the president will send federal troops to guard the protesters as they march to Montgomery. They arrive in Montgomery on March 25th, and Martin Luther King Jr. gives a speech at the Alabama Capitol building, and it's a raging success for the civil rights movement. What began as a defeat ends in success. Mm-hmm. So the final chapter here, tragically, just like with the Civil War, we go through the whole Civil War module and we see the struggle of the Union Army against the Confederacy and the long, slow march to victory and the Emancipation Proclamation and all the just the tumult and the changing of our democracy over those 4 years, we see the same thing here, and it ends in much the same fashion. We talk, sadly about Abraham Lincoln dying and the impact that that had on the American people, and later with Reconstruction. It's hard not to ask yourself how different the rest of the civil rights movement would have been, and how the civil rights movement would have changed in the 70s and 80s if Martin Luther King Jr. had not been assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee.
Yeah, so he goes there to try to settle a sanitation workers strike, and gets a judge to lift an injunction so that they, once again, he's looking out for disenfranchised people, and most of the sanitation workers were African Americans. He's also, at the same time, he's organizing a Poor People's March to Washington that he's anticipating taking place in the summer. And he gave the night before this famous mountaintop speech, which I'm sure they'll get to listen to that too.
Yeah.
One of the most prophetic speeches you will ever listen to, because in it, he seems to know that his time on earth is about to end. They're getting ready to go to dinner, and according to his associates, one of them said, "You've had a cold, let me go get your coat." And about that time, he's knocked off his feet, shot by a high-powered rifle in the throat, and he succumbs to those injuries a short time after. This is the first event from American history that I remember. I was 5 years old, and his funeral was on television, and I had never been to a funeral, and they had an open casket. And so as a 5-year-old, this still strikes me as just an incredible visual. I obviously didn't know who Martin Luther King was or what he did. I just knew that, he's in this church and people are singing, and he's not going to get out of the coffin. Unfortunately, for the movement, upon his death, unfortunately but understandably, many cities, I think the number's over 160, erupted in violence that night, which is not what he would have wanted. And there's looting and vandalism all across the nation when news of this comes up. And in fact, Bobby Kennedy is giving a speech, and he announces to the crowd, "I've just learned that Martin Luther King has been killed." And he urges people to follow his lead of nonviolent resistance. And of course, Bobby Kennedy, just 5 weeks later, will also be assassinated.
Right. And I have a friend, my best friend's dad is a little bit older, and he was grown up in the 1960s, and he lived through the Kennedy assassination and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. And he will, it's not a historical fallacy to believe that for a lot of people, the 60s began as a time of hope and ended and continued on into the 70s as despair. That these leading lights of this new movement, these young, fresh, vigorous leaders like John F. Kennedy, like Martin Luther King Jr., like Malcolm X, like Bobby Kennedy, end the decade all in cemeteries. They're all killed violently. It's not like they just had a car wreck or they succumbed to an illness. They were violently murdered. Many times on a national stage, Bobby Kennedy is killed. Cameras are rolling when Bobby Kennedy is shot. And so the MLK assassination deals a heavy blow to the movement and to the nation. And he's someone who will never be forgotten, a true icon of American history.
Yeah. And sometimes I think people talk about some personal flaws that he had, as we all do. And again, I would submit, I'm going to look over all that stuff because
I've often heard people, I can't remember who said this, but they said, when you look at the flaws of people, great people have great flaws. right? Some of the greatest individuals in the history of the world have had huge flaws in their life. You know, the things that he might or might not have done that would detract from his record as an American icon and as an American freedom fighter, you know, on the level with, you know, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, people like that. I don't think that you can take away from that, you know. And I think it is the same with, you know, people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, that yes, they had their flaws. They did things that were bad. They had poorly constructed views of the world in some cases, but we can't take the things that they may or may not have done that were bad and use that to cancel out all the wonderful things they did. And I think that applies to Martin Luther King Jr. as well.
Yeah,
so
beautifully said. Yeah.
All right. That is the end of this episode. We're going to come right back at you here in a second with another episode about the Great Society, Watergate, and the Reagan Revolution. I can't wait to get back with you and talk some more about this era of American history.